You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City, and I'm happy to be joined again by a guest we've had on recently. Adam Mount from the Federation of American Scientists is back on the podcast today. How are you doing today, Adam?
I'm all right. Yet again, shell-shocked.
Yeah, I'm shell shocked too, and I've been up for a long time. One of the pitfalls of watching Asia from the eastern coast of the United States is that time zones sometimes don't work out too well. And obviously, Adam, we're here today on June 12th, the night of June 12th, to discuss the outcomes of the historic, say what you will about it, it is historic, summit between Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The two leaders had a fairly on-script summit at the Capella Hotel on Sentosa Island in Singapore. There were a few moments where things got a little bit off the rails, and we had a Trump moment when it came to the discussion of the future of U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. We'll get to that in a bit. But for the most part, the summit went according to plan. And, you know, we've had a few hours now of punditry, about 12 hours of punditry, actually, and I think we sort of get a sense of a few kind of schools of thought forming around this issue, right? On one level, you have the more generalist analytical take that the summit was a success in the sense that it's better than where we were in November 2017, and it's certainly better than heading into nuclear war, which, fine, you know, that's I think trivially true. A lot of things are better than nuclear war. Anything that isn't nuclear war is better than nuclear war, in my view. And then you have another school of thought that, is, I think, where I would place myself, and perhaps you place yourself based on what you've been tweeting, that, you look at the history of U.S. North Korea statements going all the way back to 1993. In fact, it was June 11th, 1993, when the United States and North Korea penned their first ever bilateral joint statement in New York after working level talks. Hat tip to Joshua Pollack for reminding us of that a day before the summit in an excellent article at Arms Control Wonk, where he really tabulates the historical record on these statements.
Phenomenally helpful, yes.
Yeah, and you look at that, you look at that record, and you look at the declaration that came out of Singapore, and you can't help but be disappointed. Anyways, I'm going to stop talking, Adam, and, I obviously, want to hear what you have to say about the summit. I know there's a lot to talk about here. There's the optics, there's what comes next, there's the various moments, there's what the North Koreans heard. But first, I wanted to get your take on the declaration, the Singapore Declaration of June 12, 2018, between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. What's your bottom line takeaway from it?
Assessment of the summit has to take place on several different levels. You mentioned on one level, any summit that keeps us out of a war is a success. And I think it was also Josh Pollack who mentioned, in a particularly pointed formulation, he said, if we're in this circumstance with Donald Trump as president and we're going to meet with the North Koreans in a rushed process, then I want the stakes to be as low as possible. And this is a view that I was sympathetic to as well. There was considerable risk that Donald Trump would give away concessions or try to repackage concessions as advantageous, as wins, that he would pile on concessions as a way of elevating the visibility of the summit. And I think that concern has proved to be well-founded. So, from that perspective, if we didn't give away the store, and it was a relatively cosmetic summit, that was also better than several alternatives. I'm not sure that we even met that standard of a very limited, very modest, nothing for nothing summit. I disagree with the narrative that the summit went according to script. This is grading Donald Trump on an enormous curve. Any other president, this would have been seen as a catastrophic performance. The staging of the summit was done in a way that it provided excess legitimacy to the Kim regime. So the positioning of the American flag next to the North Korean flag. For many of us and for many veterans, that's a chilling sight. The statements that the president made to the effect of "It's my honor to meet with Kim Jong Un," that he is has the respect and the trust of his people, right? That North Korean political prisoners somehow came out ahead in the summit today.
Hmm.
The politically acceptable way to talk about these is to say that it's tone deaf, but it's frankly morally obscene to to not only gloss over, but to um, validate North Korean human rights abuses uh, to this degree. Um, that picture of where Donald Trump met with Kim Jong Un will be seen around the world. It will be seen by the families of North Korean political prisoners who are literally starving and being worked to death in North Korean camps, from North Korean defectors who have escaped to free societies, from to leaders around the world who are contemplating their own nuclear weapons programs. If this process, if this summit puts in place a process that leads to increased stability, safety, and security in Northeast Asia, that meeting will have been necessary.
Hmm.
But that image can never be taken back. We absolutely must make the most of it. It is a one-time event that absolutely cannot be wasted and cannot come to naught. So, in many ways, I'm extremely concerned that the way the summit went, the way that it was scripted, the way that it was formed, the concessions that Trump piled on afterward will make it extremely difficult for us to maintain our leverage through the ensuing peace process and further negotiations.
I think that's right. And I think that's I said as much on Twitter as the summit was playing out, and in a few pieces of analysis after that. I do want to visit this point about legitimacy, because it's actually turned out to be quite polarizing.
Right.
Here, I again pointed this out on Twitter. I completely agree with you that everything about this summit made it, if you were an untrained observer and you looked at the summit meeting between these two guys and you see these flags, and you would have no reason to believe that these weren't two countries with a long history of cordial, normalized diplomatic relations. But
Right.
obviously, that's not where the United States and North Korea are. So I pointed out that say what you will, Kim Jong Un definitely is going to get what he's always wanted out of this photo op. He does get that legitimizing effect. But I was sort of making that as a as a positivist observation. I think that was always the case. Even before, if North Korea had entered and implemented a previous denuclearization agreements in good faith, it would have been rewarded with a presidential summit at some point, and these
Right.
optics would have been inherent in that. But I agree with you that this summit itself, the pageantry itself, is a concession. And if the United States does have to sit at the table with the odious tyrant that is Kim Jong Un, then it should well make sure that it's prepared. It's willing to enter into talks that will result in something real. But here, I think it was really something for nothing exchange, and the United States really walked away with very little.
I
Um,
think I think that's right.
mhm.
If the communique had been drafted in Pyongyang, it could have appeared in exactly the same format. It was a little astonishing just how little the United States succeeded in inserting into that joint communique. Right? You and I have talked about the language on denuclearization was astonishingly, stunningly weak. Right? The formulation that many people expected was to combine CVID, complete verifiable irreversible dismantlement, with denuclearization of the peninsula, and sort of shove those together. But the words verifiable and irreversible don't appear in the communique.
Mhm.
And then there's also this strange reference that reaffirms the language in the Panmunjom Declaration, which implies that there is no additional concession being made here over and above the Panmunjom summit, which most people saw as punting the issue of denuclearization. So, from that perspective, it's really astonishing that at the height of American leverage, that no stronger commitment, timetable, and practical concession could be wrung out of the North Koreans.
Right, right. I think that's, a really important observation. And you're right. I mean, I personally don't overwhelmingly credit the maximum pressure campaign with bringing Kim to the table. I really think it was what he says it was, which is the virtual completion of his credible nuclear deterrent. But certainly maximum pressure had increased U.S. economic leverage over North Korea to previously unseen levels, especially with the 3 sanctions resolutions last year at the UN Security Council.
Right,
and you're right.
That leverage just evaporates from now on.
Yeah,
right? It becomes harder and harder to hold North Korea to strict arms control arrangements,
right,
rather than easier and easier.
Right, and maximum pressure is dead in the water. RIP maximum pressure. The Chinese are already talking about sanctions relief for North Korea, and Kim Jong-un came to the table in relatively good faith, and especially after the May 24th cancellation of the summit, which was we did an emergency podcast last time, and then the summit. Here we are talking about the summit, and it ended up happening. It really made Kim throughout this process look a little bit more like the reasonable party willing to take diplomacy seriously for once. I want to go back quickly to the language on denuclearization. This is something that is probably the biggest. There's a chasm here that separates Korea watchers from the general public. When I have to explain this in every kind of press appearance interview that I do, is that the phrase "complete denuclearization" sounds great. Right? Complete denuclearization. What's not to like about that? North Korea clearly says that it's going to get rid of its nuclear weapons, right? And every time it's the same thing. I mean, this language has a long history. There are serious hermeneutics involved here with what each side understands out of these framings. And that whole proposal that we thought was live for a moment, where Pompeo was suggesting that CVI, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, would be mashed up together, it just didn't really make sense. I mean, the concepts are fundamentally at odds,
right,
in terms of what the United States understands with CVID, or with 3/4 of that compared to what North Korea sees. And reaffirming the Panmunjom definition of denuclearization, for me, that was the kind of low water mark, is that's where we start, and anything above that is where Trump starts to get points for performing well. And unfortunately, he came in at par. He didn't come in under par, right? Denuclearization did make an appearance in the statement, but really, there's nothing new here. That's kind of the big picture here, is that North Korea, in this statement, did not agree to anything that it had not already agreed to, either at the Inter-Korean Summit or in previous arrangements with the United States. And it also did not necessarily agree to anything that it hadn't already announced that it would be willing to accept in various statements that came out through KCNA in the lead up to the summit.
Right. North Korea succeeded in holding their line. They resisted that pressure. But the same cannot be said of the Trump administration. So the concession that Trump offered after the summit is on USFK exercises is astonishing. It's over and above the expert consensus on what would be possible with respect to modifications in USFK force structure. It is over and above the preferences of our allies, of the Pentagon. It is frankly an enormous concession that I'm not even convinced was requested by Kim Jong-un. They're celebrating that statement in their subsequent KCNA release, as a measure that they had long sort of hoped for. But I think this might have been something that Trump donated. It wasn't made a specific condition of this communique by the North Koreans. There are consistent indications that Donald Trump thinks of vitiating the U.S.-South Korea alliance as a benefit,
right?
That saves him money on the financial side, right, rather than as a concession to the North Koreans. And the way that it was announced, right, it was clearly not coordinated with the Pentagon. It was clearly, the South Koreans were clearly not informed of it. That is massively destructive to American credibility for any talks going forward. It absolutely invites the North Koreans to try to push on U.S. force posture as hard as possible, right? Because Trump has indicated that he's willing to give ground on that front.
Right, which is no surprise.
But furthermore, it does systematic and possibly irreparable damage to the sort of the legitimacy and the standing of U.S. forces Korea.
Right. look, like the alliance is definitely, I've been very uncomfortable about where the alliance has been and is going, certainly throughout the first half of 2018, but also in 2017. And this statement, I want to go back to this idea that this was something that Trump organically brought up. And I don't want to get too much here into, trying to read Trump's mind, because God knows I'm not qualified to do that. I thought it was interesting that he specifically comes out of this summit meeting and he's talking about bomber flights of all things, and he's talking about the flying time hours, and he says, "I know a lot about airplanes." And that to me, when I thought about that, I totally imagined. You remember the language last year in August with the the Sky Pirates of Guam. Obviously, North Korea has long complained about bomber flights from Guam, so I could see it as something that they bring up, right? I mean, Kim Jong-un threatened to bracket Guam with Hwasong 12s last year unless the U.S. Backed off on bomber flights. So I think the North Koreans have a good read on Trump, right? They talked about the Trump formula in the KCNA statement that came out from Kim Kye-gwan in the lead up to the summit. After Trump had canceled it, he said that, maybe the Trump formula will work. So I think, they have this guy figured out, especially after, the Doddard statement last year. They know he's sensitive to cost, that he's kind of a profit and loss kind of guy. He comes from a real estate business background. So it's like, hey, talk to him about how much it costs to house U.S. troops at Camp Humphreys, right? And talk to him about SMA talks, talk to him about bomber flight hours. It seems to have worked. So, I mean, my read, it's interesting that, you kind of saw this as Trump organically raising it, which is, I think, also entirely possible, because this is something that he keeps on bringing up at campaign rallies and the like, the costs of, host nation support, maintaining alliances. But in this case, it was specific enough that I actually think that the North Koreans had a pretty good read on how they could get this concession. And at the beginning I did say that it was mostly on script as far as the protocol went. This was the huge, the X factor, the Trump moment that everybody had been wondering. What happens if you leave Trump and Kim Jong-un in a room alone together with translators? What does Trump end up conceding? And I think this was it. This was that moment.
Right. And so there's something else that you and I have talked about frequently, is twice now on Twitter, Donald Trump has crowed about a claim that the North Koreans have paused research on nuclear and missile programs. He said it twice now, and in my mind, this is absolutely not something we can overlook. It is dangerous on several levels, right? Just to sort of lay the groundwork, Trump. There's no way that the United States can be certain that North Korea has paused research, right? Either Trump is taking Kim Jong-un's word for it, or he's just fabricating this idea out of thin air because he thinks that it sounds good. It is massively unverifiable, even if international inspectors were on the ground in North Korean fissile material production facilities. So, right, it certainly would be nice to have, but the entire intelligence bureaucracy should be, and very likely is, telling him that we cannot certify that. We have no reason to believe that this is true. Right? And in fact, North Korea has not offered a concession all spring that in any way impedes the progress of their nuclear and missile programs, other than limits on nuclear and missile testing. So we have every reason to believe that research is still continuing, that development is still continuing, that we are now moving well into the phase where that Pompeo said at the beginning of the year, North Koreans would have the ability to strike the continental United States.
Right.
So why is this dangerous? Well, one of the reasons is Donald Trump seems to think that he's imposed a hard cap on the North Korean nuclear and missile program, and that he's prevented North Korea from crossing that threshold. So to the extent that he is reasoning rationally, he is doing so on a false assumption, which is that he believes that he has, imposed a cap on the North Koreans that he hasn't. That makes it more difficult to impose that cap later. But also, it's a huge problem for American credibility, right? It was always going to be a problem that we couldn't trust Donald Trump to give us an accurate readout of North Korean statements and guarantees. In that regard, it was helpful that there was a textual communique that was released at the summit.
Right.
But, the North Koreans said nothing about halting research, and so the it's essentially a lie to the American people about what was agreed, presumably for political purposes at home, but also American allies will be concerned that they're not getting the whole story,
Yeah,
and I think justifiably so.
yeah, yeah. I've been thinking about this. Those tweets were
Do you think
certainly
I'm
weird.
inflating the concern?
No, no,
Inflating,
no, no, not that. I
right?
mean, I think what you outlined is entirely plausible and entirely within Trump's, capacity for fabrication. But if I,
Which is virtually limitless.
right, right, and I
Yeah,
mean, if I had to kind of, I've been thinking about this, and this business that came up with the missile engine test stand, right? That was a super weird, specific technical concession that came up at the Singapore summit that Trump reportedly asked Kim. He said, "Hey, you guys have this missile engine test stand, and we can see it because of the heat." So he was talking about U.S. ISR capabilities
right.
to Kim Jong Un. But he said, "Hey, it'd be great if you guys could dismantle this because we're worried about it." And Kim reportedly say yes. I mean, obviously the North Koreans didn't include this in their statement. I don't think that's surprising, but that's a super weird moment that came out of the summit that Trump out of all things decides to fixate on a missile engine test stand. And then, I went back to those tweets about research, and I wonder, Trump's no technical expert on arms control. I wonder if he was using research as shorthand for like something like static engine testing, which I know is, entirely irresponsible, doesn't absolve him of making that statement. But in my mind, maybe he, saw that 38 North report about the dismantling of the canister test stand, and he's reading that as a sign that they're stopping research, which is obviously hugely exaggerated, right? One test
Right.
stand does not mean that all of their R&D is off. But in my mind, that's one plausible explanation if I was going to be super charitable to Trump.
Yes.
But I want to talk about that engine thing a bit more, because that's actually a really interesting technical concession.
Right.
Because in my mind, I think that the engine's test stand that they're talking about, which we don't have any confirmation on yet, is probably the static solid fuel test stand at Hamhung at the Magunpo site that open source experts have identified, and that's where North Korea conducted a test of a large unknown engine in October. That I reported at the Diplomat, and we don't know what that engine was for, but a lot of us think that where North Korea is going next after showing off that it has liquid propellant engines for its ICBMs is eventually a solid propellant engine program for longer range missiles, right? We have the Pukuksong 2, and this is something that they're going to work on. It would make complete sense, right? If Trump has technical experts backing him, which Pompeo says that he does, right? Pompeo says that there was technical support
Right.
going into this
Right.
process. It would make complete sense to fixate on that solid fuel test stand as a technical concession. So that was actually something that I was actually quite happy to see come up, even though obviously, we're kind of pulling at strings here. I mean,
But
we have a
so
verbal
you think that
assurance
that
by
was
Trump.
something that was you think that was something that was explicitly requested and received as a concession? Because the way that Trump addressed that in his press conference was that he said the North Koreans offered us this after the statement was signed and agreed.
Right, right. And yeah, it's actually unclear to me who asked for what there, because later then he makes it sound like he notified Kim Jong Un that, the US was observing this site with the space-based infrared sensors,
Right.
and wanted them to back off on it. But it's a really interesting, thing that came out of all this, and maybe it's something that comes up in, the next round of talks. They'll be led by Pompeo. And we kind of start hitting the road. Sung Kim, in an interview today on the sidelines of the summit before Trump spoke, said that there's a lot more work to be done. He was trying to be very diplomatic about where the process was standing. So this is the kind of stuff that I think we've talked about before, Adam, and we hinted at it in our Atlantic article where we argued that this is the kind of sweating the details that needs to happen. I mean, obviously, again, we're grasping at
Yeah.
straws here. This is
I'm-
very this is
Well,
very tenuous,
right, and they're
but it's
very
something.
thin straws. They're sort of cocktail stirrers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to. I just want to put in context this concession on the missile test stand. If North Korea were genuinely interested in disarming, and this is an assumption that many people are making, right, including the South Korean defense minister, is making a charitable assumption of North Koreans' intentions to disarm and working backwards from there, then they should be willing to disclose sensitive facilities,
Right.
um, right, and admit inspectors at an early date, agree to the principle of verification, certainly rhetorically, but also in practice, right? Put on the table a concrete timetable, right? Disclosure of information about nuclear sites, fissile material stocks, hidden facilities, the shape and structure of their arsenal. All of these things could have been issued and offered at the summit. Just as a matter of course, it could have been negotiated ahead of time with Sung Kim's technical negotiating team, and they could have received fair value for that. All of these would have been plausible concessions that I would classify as major concessions.
Mm-hmm.
I take your point that dismantlement of the solid fuel test stand would be a consequential step that limits future development. But like Punggye-ri,
it's a reverse.
Verification is important, right? It's not conclusive that it prevents further development of these types of systems. I do not myself classify that as a major stepping stone towards denuclearization.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like pulling back, my wish list would be for them to declare their covert enrichment facilities, the underground facilities that are rumored to exist in North Korea. Let's talk about those. Obviously, we're really a far cry from that. But Adam, we're at the end of our time on today's podcast. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you if you had any closing thoughts for us today.
So many thoughts on so many different levels. The real consequences of this summit. Kim Jong-un met many of his objectives already. By virtue of holding the summit and by virtue of American policy disorganization and mismanagement in the run-up to the summit, right? Sources of American pressure, sanctions, alliances, legitimacy, military exercises, all four of these elements of American pressure have been attrited in one way or another, right? So that's already a pretty significant gain for Kim Jong-un. American and allied interests depend completely on what happens in the weeks and months ahead. I worry that the summit didn't set us up to succeed in that effort, but it absolutely must be prosecuted and pursued diligently with the participation of technical experts and with full application of American leverage as far as it can possibly go. The message that I'm trying to send in this podcast is that the process has not been ideal, but no one's rooting for it to fail.
Right.
What we're saying is that it absolutely must succeed, and trying to sound the alarm that certain trends are not helpful in that regard.
Right. No, I think that's a really good and I think a good faith note to end on, honestly. I mean, yeah, I felt like a wet blanket all day because I've been, critical of the outcome of this summit declaration. But really, I mean, everybody wants to see this process succeed. It's just, been overwhelmingly unlikely with the factors. I mean, even leaving aside the fact that the American principal ultimately at the end of the day is Donald Trump. It was encouraging to see at the end of the day that we did have a team of experienced technical negotiators enter the room at the DMZ with their North Korean counterparts. Many of Sung Kim and Cho Sun-hui have known each other for more than a decade now. They get this stuff. They know the background. They know the history. Right. But really, I wonder, what if we weren't married to June 12th? That negotiations had carried on all summer, and they'd met in the early fall in September, for instance. I mean, what could have been possible? We won't know. We might find out over the course of the sustained process. But I also worry that this statement that we have in our hands now is the foundation for this round of U.S. North Korea rapprochement. I think ultimately
for better and for worse.
Right, exactly.
Right? And that question of what could have been possible, will haunt us for decades.
Yeah, of course. All right, Adam. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, but you're not yet a subscriber, please make sure you do subscribe on either iTunes or Google Play. If you are a subscriber, but you haven't left us a review yet on either of those platforms, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening.
Follow the work of Ankit and myself at the Federation of American Scientists Defense Posture Project.
Right, exactly. Full disclosure, I am Adam's colleague also at the Federation of American Scientists, in addition to being the diplomat. So yes, do check that out. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.